So now we're going to begin Chapter 6, the urinary system. It's the first chapter in this next unit. It's going to include chapters 6 through 9. So the first thing to really talk about is the function of the urinary system and what does it do for you. Most people can obviously think of it removing waste from your body, both solid and liquid waste, but it does a few other things as well. By removing fluids from your body, it can help regulate your fluid volume inside your body, and it can also help maintain electrolyte concentrations in your body fluids. So electrolytes include things like sodium, potassium, calcium, and that's kind of regulated moving in and out of your body and waste fluids. And finally, because of this fluid retention inside the body, it can also assist in blood pressure regulation. The more fluids you retain, then that can, increase the blood pressure in your body. The less fluids, decreasing blood pressure. Up until this point, the systems that we have been looking at have been identical between males and females. This is the first system that our anatomical differences cause a difference in the urinary system as well. So the key parts are still there, they're just a little bit different. So one major difference here is the urethra, and I'll get into all the different parts in a minute, but the urethra is what carries the urine from the bladder out into the outside world. And in a female, that's about 1.5 inches long. But for a male, it's actually 8 inches long because it goes all the way from the bladder through the penis and out. And so that's kind of one of the key differences. So in this case, the penis is considered both part of the reproductive system that we'll be learning later, but it's also part of the urinary system because it serves a functional role. And when you think about this length difference between males and females, this is one of those reasons that, females get urinary infections much more so than males, just because, the pathway of infection from the outside world in is a lot shorter. And another thing you might notice from looking at the picture is the bladder. The male bladder is much larger than the female bladder, and the female bladder sits under the uterus. So this is one of those reasons why females always seem to have to go to the bathroom more so than males, especially pregnant women who have their uterus, crushing their bladder. Okay, so breaking down the urinary system, the kind of first functional component are the kidneys. You have 2 kidneys, one on either side of your vertebral column. They're shaped like beans and they're situated, above your hips, and they're protected by the, lower part of your ribs. And their job is to remove the waste from the blood. So blood actually, travels through the kidneys, and then waste is pulled out of the blood and into the urinary system so that it can be expelled from the body. And because it does this, it can also, pull water out of the blood as well, and therefore regulate water and electrolytes. We're not really going to get into the specific anatomy and physiology of the kidney, but the basic urine-producing component, or the basic unit of the kidney, is called the nephron. And there's over 1 million of these in each kidney. The picture on the top right there is an example of, zoomed in what one nephron looks like and its little functional parts. I'm not going to expect you to know what all these are, but there will be some medical terms dealing with it in a little bit. Finally, here we have the renal pelvis, and the renal pelvis is kind of the funnel coming out of the kidney to the next portion of the urinary system. This is where the urine is going to collect, coming out of the kidneys heading towards the bladder. After the renal pelvis come the ureters or ureters, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is basically just a slender tube, and it's about a foot long, and it serves as a passageway for the urine to go from the kidneys into the bladder. The bladder itself is a muscular, hollow organ. Its job is just to be a bag to hold urine. From the bladder, we then have the urethra, which I mentioned before, is anatomically different between males and females, but it's the lowest part of the urinary tract where the urine goes from the bladder to outside the body. The actual opening is called the urinary meatus. Meatus is just the generic term meaning opening. For example, we had it when we had external auditory meatus in the ear. Here's just a diagram illustrating the general flow of urine. Initially, the blood is going to pass through the kidneys, and then the urine is filtered out of the blood in the kidney. It will then pool in the renal pelvis, where it travels down the ureters into the bladder. It will then pool until it goes through the urethra and through the urinary meatus and outside the body. It's a very simple system, and so most of our medical terms are going to, overlap in terms of reusage. Now that we have the system down and function down, we can begin to learn the combining forms associated with these structures. Most of these terms are pretty self-explanatory, and then they go with the anatomical structure and spelling. The first of which is cysto. Cysto in general means bladder or sac. So we might have seen this previously in other terms meaning sac, but you could also use vesico. Most of the time we're going to use cysto, but sometimes we use the other. Glomerulo goes to the glomerulus. We didn't specifically talk about it, but the glomerulus is the portion of the nephron, that kidney unit, whose job is to actually, pull the waste products out of the blood. And there's a picture of it in your book, zoomed in on page 209 if you want to get a closer look of it. Meato goes to meatus, which in general is any opening. In this case, we're going to be talking about the urinary meatus. Nephro or reno. Nephro, you would think means directly nephron, but it's more broad. Both of these terms mean kidney, and we're going to use both of them quite often. Pyelo. Pyelo is the kind of weird one out. It means renal pelvis, and so that's the portion of the kidney where the urine pools before moving down the ureters into the bladder. Then we have uretero for uretero for the ureter and the urethro for the urethra. Take a moment, if you have a diagram, add these to the diagram. If not, then you can do this in exercise figure A and B on page 212 and 213. Here are the combining forms of words that are used with the urinary system, but not specifically talking about the anatomy. So the first one is albumino, which means albumin, and we don't really talk a whole lot about it, but it has to do with proteins and pressure regulation within the urinary system. We also have azoto, which means urine or nitrogen, urea or nitrogen. And we're going to learn a little bit about what urea is. And nitrogen, those are kind of part of the waste products that are filtered out of your blood. We also have blasto. We've seen that one early on in the units where it means a developing cell. So for example, a blastoma would be a tumor of a developing cell. Glycoso, glyco, Both of those mean sugar. And in this case, when you're talking about the urinary system in the kidneys filtering out your blood, you have to think about all the things inside of the blood too. So sugar is one of them. Hydro means water. Litho, I think we've seen this one before, but it means stone or calculus, which is the fancy medical way of saying a stone. So when we talked about gallstones in the digestive chapter, we saw litho, but now in this chapter we're going to talk about kidney stones. Nocti, think of nocturnal. Nocti means night, and we're going to see this term used, for example, bedwetting, or when you go to the bathroom at night, that's when we'll see this term. Oligo means few. So for example, if you're not urinating as much as you should, then maybe you would have this term. And then urino and uro, both of those mean urine specifically, or the urinary tract. Here's the list of suffixes for this chapter, but you've seen a lot of these ones before. We know that lysis means to loosen or to break up or to separate. We've learned ptosis, if something is sagging or drooping. We've learned raphy. Note the R-R-H-A-P-H-Y. Raphy means a suturing or repair, so you're fixing something. Other terms on here, the first pair, iasis or esis, means a condition. And we've seen osis also means a condition of, but here we see a few more that mean the same thing. Trypsy. Trypsy means surgical crushing. And this is going to be used when we talk about getting rid of stones. We can do something called surgical crushing, where you kind of manually go in and crush these stones to kind of make it easier to remove. We also have trophy. I think we've seen this one before also, but trophy means nourishment or development. So if you think of hypertrophy, it's excess development, or hypotrophy is not enough development. And the last suffix, urea, just like urino or uro as the word root, here urea means urine or urination. So depending on what medical term we're going to be forming, you might use the word root version, or you might use the suffix version, depending what you're combining it with. Now that we have all the parts down, we can move on to the diseases and disorders, first from word parts, then not from word parts. Here's the list of disease and disorder terms built from word parts. The first one is azotemia or uremia. Both of them are kind of used interchangeably. And if we remember a while back, emia means blood. So azotemia means that you have urea in the blood. And urea is one of those substances or waste products that's supposed to be filtered out of the blood by the kidney. And so in this condition, that filtering is not taking place, so you have a buildup of this waste product. There's a number of itises on this page. So for example, cystitis would be inflammation of the bladder. You can also have nephritis, pyelitis, ureteritis. All of those would be inflammations of their respective areas. The next is a cystocele. I'm not sure if we've seen cele as a suffix before, C-E-L-E, but it means protrusion. So that anatomical structure is pushing out into a region that it's not supposed to be. So a cystocele would be a protrusion of the bladder. And then in the second column, we also have a ureterocele, so protrusion of the ureter. And in this case, that's usually where the tube protrudes back up into the bladder. We have cystolith, lith meaning stone, so in this case you would have a stone in the bladder. but you can have stones in other portions of the urinary system as well. So in this case, you can have a nephrolith, for example, and the condition is nephrolithiasis, where you have a stone in the kidney. You can also have ureterolithiasis, where the stone is now in the ureter, whether it formed there or started in the kidney or bladder and is traveling down. That would be, the pathway of which you pass a kidney stone. Other terms on here, we have glomerulonephritis. This is another inflammation, but it's talking specifically of the glomerulus of the kidney. You can also have hydronephrosis, so a condition of water in the kidney. And this is where the kidney is responsible for filtering out excess water from the blood, but it's somehow being retained in the kidney. You can have nephroblastoma. This is a tumor condition of the developing kidney cells. You can have nephrohypertrophy. So this would be excessive development of the kidney tissue. So you would have an enlarged, perhaps non-functional kidney. Nephroma, just in general, is a tumor of the kidney. Nephromegaly. Nephromegaly would be enlargement of the kidney. So it's larger than its normal size. Nephroptosis. Ptosis as a suffix means drooping. And here we're talking about how, the kidneys are in their special location on either side of the vertebral column above the hips. So if for some reason one of them, falls below its normal anatomical position, that would be nephroptosis. We have other itises here. And another one we might not have remembered from previous times is ureterostenosis. Stenosis is a suffix, and if you remember, it means a narrowing. So ureterostenosis would be a narrowing of the ureter, and in this case, it's the tube that passes from the bladder, from the kidney to the bladder. So if that is narrowed, then you're going to have a buildup of fluids in the kidney, not enough fluids going into the bladder and causing all kinds of issues. The last term here is erythrocystitis, and that would be inflammation of both the urethra area and the bladder area. So you string the word roots together when you're talking about inflammation in multiple areas. This is a lot of terms, so take a moment and try exercise 10 on page 219 just to begin to get all of these straight. This is a slide to just help you clarify a few medical terms. We have hematuria and azotemia, and they both sound, when you define them, like similar conditions, but they're not quite. Hematuria is when you have blood in the urine. So for some medical reason, there is blood going into the urine. Whereas azotemia means that you are not filtering out the waste from the blood, so you have excess waste in the blood. That doesn't mean you're urinating blood, it means that the blood has been contaminated by waste. Azotemia is also called uremia, and for the last bullet point here, just know that hematuria, blood in the urine, is a symptom, usually of some kind of issue, whereas azotemia is a serious disorder where your blood is contaminated with these wastes. Hematuria can happen in a number of different conditions, so that's why it's considered just a symptom of a larger issue. Now we're on to the diseases and disorders that aren't built from word parts, but I think most of them have components that are built from word parts enough to be able to figure these out somewhat easily. The first two are epispadias and hypospadias, and these pertain to where the urethra is located in a male. Actually, hypospadias can actually occur in a female as well, but the urethra in a male, it normally comes out, through the center of the penis. If that tract is somehow congenitally misplaced, either above its normal anatomical position, that's where the epi comes from, or below the anatomical position, that's where hypo comes from, then it's considered one of these two conditions. And, the urethra in this case is still functional, but the, reproductive component of a male is then, non-functional, possibly just because of where the location ends up being. The next term is polycystic kidney disease, and just as it sounds, it's a condition on the kidney in which you have a lot of cysts forming. And you can see the picture here in the bottom right. The left kidney is a normal, happy, healthy kidney. The one on the right has PKD, polycystic kidney disease. And you can see all those little black kind of nodules. Those are the cysts all over the kidney. And having these can obviously damage the kidney, prevent it from functioning, and so on. Next is renal calculus. Calculus, fancy medical term for stone. So you have a kidney stone, basically. A single stone is called a renal calculus. If you have more than one stone, then it's called calculi. So just think of it, if you're in calculus now, think of calculus giving you kidney stones if you don't like it so much. Next we have renal failure, and that's just where the kidney becomes non-functional. And there are different stages of renal failure. The first is acute renal failure, and I'm not going to expect you to know what the different levels are. This is more just for your own knowledge. But acute renal failure is kind of sudden onset. Maybe you had an accident, some kind of trauma, bleeding, obstruction, infection, even a bad drug reaction can cause acute renal failure. And with proper medical intervention, it can be reversed. The next is chronic kidney disease. That's kind of the next level of renal failure. And this is progressive, meaning it gets worse. It's irreversible, meaning you can't fix it. And this could be caused by, severe hypertension or even diabetes. But the gist is that the kidney is slowly dying, and you would constantly need a dialysis machine, which we'll learn about in a little bit, and eventually a kidney transplant. And the final stage of renal failure is end-stage renal disease, or chronic renal failure, and that's basically where the kidney is no longer able to sustain life. So unless you had a machine keeping your kidneys going constantly, it could not sustain your life. Back to the list here, we have renal hypertension, and this is an instance where the kidneys is actually causing hypertension, and it does this because the kidneys are supposed to filter out excess fluids from the blood. So if the kidney is not functioning properly and not taking those fluids out of the blood, then the blood just has a higher volume that's trying to pump through the veins and arteries. And therefore it causes extra pressure on those blood vessel walls, causing hypertension. The next two terms, we have urinary retention and urinary suppression. Urinary retention means that you are retaining urine, or you are basically holding it in. It's, staying in your bladder instead of coming out, that kind of thing. Urinary suppression means that you are just not forming urine as much as you should. So, your kidney isn't filtering out enough waste to make urine, that kind of thing. And the last one is a urinary tract infection. And as I mentioned in the very early slides, this is a condition that usually afflicts females more than males because of the shorter urethra, but it really can pertain to any type of infection anywhere in the urinary tract. We normally think of it as kind of the urethra and bladder infection or a lower urinary tract infection, but we can also have kidney issues and ureter issues as well. Here's an example of what a urinary tract infection could look like. As I mentioned on the last slide, a lower urinary tract infection would affect the bladder and the urethra. And as you can see in the blown up picture, cystitis or inflammation of the bladder could be a consequence of a urinary tract infection. And if these lower tract infections are left untreated, it can actually infect the upper urinary tract as well. So for example, a female having a UTI and leaves it untreated for a prolonged period of time, it could make its way back up to the kidneys. Once it's in the upper urinary tract, then it's much more difficult to treat, and it's also quite painful. This slide, I won't go through it step by step again, but it basically recaps what those different stages of renal failure are that I had mentioned. You won't be expected to know all of these different levels. It's just an FYI for you. Which one of these terms means stones in the kidney? Hopefully, looking at these, you can understand that stones has to do with calculi or calculus. You can narrow it down to C or E. But the key here is it says stones, plural. So the correct answer is C. Had it said stone, meaning singular, E would have been the appropriate choice. We will now move on to the surgical terms. And here we have both ones from word parts and not from word parts. Looking at these surgical terms, you'll notice that many of the word roots are used over and over and over again. So the key here is in the suffixes. We have a number of ectomies, meaning removal of a certain area. We also have a lot of tomies or tomies. These are the surgical incisions into a certain particular area. And then we have a few others that I'll mention. But first we have a cystectomy. So you would remove the bladder. We also have nephrectomy if you are going to remove a kidney, or ureterectomy, you might need to remove a ureter as well. When we're thinking about otomy, you could have a cystotomy, and that would be an incision into the bladder. You can also have a cystolithotomy, and so that's where we add that extra word root of litho, meaning stone. So this would be an incision into the bladder for the purposes of removing a stone. Let's see. You can also have a pyelolithotomy if you need to remove a stone from the renal pelvis as well. We have the suffix stomy here, meaning an artificial opening or the creation of an artificial opening. Here we have cystostomy, so we're going to create an artificial opening into the bladder, and this would be between the bladder and, the outside surface of the skin or the outside world, for example. Maybe something happened with the urethra, non-functional, you need to be able to get your waste out from the bladder. That would be when that situation would be called for. Other incisions, you can have a meatotomy, which means you're cutting into the meatus, probably to enlarge it for whatever reason. The hole by which you urinate is not big enough, causing constriction or probably constant urinary tract infections and such. Let's see. The only other ones I want to really draw your attention to in terms of suffixes, we have trypsy. If we remember, trypsy is surgical crushing, so a lithotripsy, and just in general, is surgical crushing of a stone. Maybe you have a very large stone, so this is one way by which to make them smaller and easier to pass, less painful. We have pexy as a suffix, as seen in nephropexy. This would be surgical fixation. For example, if you have nephroptosis or a drooping kidney, you would need it kind of surgically fixated back into its anatomical location. So you would do a nephropexy. And in this case, all the other terms are pretty much self-explanatory. The only last one that's not maybe is a vesicourethral suspension. And that just means that you kind of like surgical fixation, but it pertains to the bladder and the urethra. Take a moment now, do exercise 18. A lot of these word roots are used over and over, so you really got to get the practice of the suffixes. Here I'm asking you what the correct medical term for incision into the renal pelvis to remove a stone. Is it pyelolithostomy or pyelolithotomy? And hopefully you chose B. B is when you make the incision. Stomy would be the creation of an artificial opening. Here we have surgical terms not built from word parts, and as you'll notice, there's not very many of them. But here it's just really long. Extracorporeal shock wave lithotripsy. And if you remember, extracorporeal is a fancy way of saying outside of the body, so it's non-invasive. And lithotripsy, we learned, is surgical crushing. So what this procedure is it basically uses shock waves administered kind of through the skin to the affected area, and those shock waves break up the stone, whether it be in the kidney or another area of the body. It breaks up the stone and therefore makes it easier to pass. The next term is fulguration, and as soon as the guys see the picture, you're going to cringe in your seat, but this is a method that's used to destroy growths, maybe like small cysts or what could be tumors, but it uses little tiny electric sparks to destroy growths, and I'll explain it a little bit in a minute. And the last, renal transplant, very self-explanatory. You need to take a kidney from another person and transplant it because that first individual has some kind of renal failure. Here's an example of what fulguration looks like, and this particular one is used to destroy a growth inside the bladder. So trying to make it non-invasive, meaning that you're not going to be cutting into the individual. They use this particular method. So they insert a telescope through the penis, up the urethra, and into the bladder. And then the end of the telescope has tiny little electric shock waves that can destroy the growth. And this could be done in females as well, just if obviously not done in this particular way. Here's an example cartoon of a renal transplant. You'll see the two host kidneys right in their normal anatomical position, and then you can see the donor kidney is attached a little bit lower on. So I find that very interesting. If you think about a kidney transplant, it's not always taking out the bad one and putting in the new good one. In this case, they leave the bad original kidney in and just put in an additional kidney and then hook it up to the appropriate blood vessels and to the ureters that travel to the bladder. And if you wonder why this is, it would just to eliminate one extra possible complication one extra medical procedure of removing the one kidney. So anyone who's got a renal transplant actually has 3 kidneys inside their body. So now we're on to the diagnostic terms, and there's 2 sections. There's diagnostic imaging, and then there's also endoscopic procedures, which you'll see in a little bit. But for diagnostic imaging, it's mostly using radiographic images, so using X-ray machines to gather information about the urinary system. And because of that, just keep in mind the difference in the suffixes. Gram is the image itself. Graphy is the process of gathering that image or taking the actual radiographic X-ray. So cystogram is the image of the bladder, whereas cystography would be the actual imaging of the bladder. You can also have a urogram, and there's different types. There's an intravenous urogram or an IVU, and this is where a contrast medium has been injected intravenously, and that contrast media can then be X-rayed to give you an idea of what's going on in the urinary system. You can also have a retrograde urogram, and in that case, instead of being contrast media delivered intravenously, it's delivered through a urinary catheter, which I'll tell you what that is exactly in a little bit. But the catheter then injects contrast media into the bladder and ureter, so you can get an idea of what's going on there. We can have nephrography. Nephrography would be imaging of the kidney, and therefore you would get a nephrogram. Or you could also have a nephrotomogram, which is a picture of the kidney, but it's just one particular slice. The word root tomo means a slice of. You can do nephrosonography, and a sonograph or sonogram has to do with ultrasound. So nephrosonography is basically doing an ultrasound on the kidney. And the last term here, voiding cystourethropy. This would be using radiographic imaging of the bladder and the urethra, but they're going to look at this both before and during urination. If there's somehow an issue with that process, this particular procedure would hopefully catch that. So here are 2 images. The one on the left is a traditional cystogram. So it's a radiographic image of the bladder, and you can see that it's been filled with contrast media via a catheter. The other is a CT urogram. So a CT scan or a CAT scan is similar to a radiographic image, but remember it takes it at all different angles and gives you a better overall picture or reconstructed view. And this is kind of what's used mostly today. But you can see how it shows you a particular issue here with the ureter on the left side, or the patient's right side, coming down from the kidney. More examples here. On the left you have a nephrotomogram. So it is a picture of the kidney, in this case a slice, and you can see, well, obviously you can see the vertebral column, which is that large white structure towards the middle of the left picture. But the little white arrows are pointing to kidney stones, and you can see kind of the 2 major stones located in the kidney in this cross-sectional image. On the right you have a renogram, which is also called a nephrogram. They're used fairly interchangeably. And you can see what that image of the kidney looks like. It's a lot more kind of opaque and ambiguous. Here are the endoscopic terms, and they're very straightforward as long as you keep the 2 suffixes in line. So we have scope and scopy. Scope is the actual instrument, whereas scopy is the process or procedure of looking. So cystoscope and scopy have to do with the bladder, nephroscopy has to do with the kidney, and ureteroscopy and scope have to do with the ureter or urethra. Here are the terms not built from word parts. The first one is called a cube, standing for kidney, ureter, and bladder. And this is a radiographic image done in the abdomen. And this large radiographic image allows you to view the kidneys and the ureters and the bladder kind of all together. And the host, so you look at size, shape, location. It could also give you info about kidney stones. But it's kind of a good first picture of what's going on in that general area. The next list comes for lab tests that can be ordered to try to diagnose certain conditions. The first one, a BUN, or blood urea nitrogen. It's pronounced bune, and this is when it measures the level of urea in the blood. And urea is one of those toxic waste components supposed to be filtered out by the kidney, so the amount in the blood can give you an idea of kidney function. The next is creatinine, and that's another blood test that measures that particular substance in the blood, and if there are higher levels in the blood, that can again point to kidney malfunction for not filtering out that excess. Specific gravity is a urine test, and this talks to the concentrating or diluting ability of the kidneys. So it basically measures the concentration of the urine and gives you an idea of how much water the kidney is filtering out of the blood. And the last, urinalysis, is the basic standard pee in a cup test. It's all the normal routine tests that are performed on a urine specimen. So anytime you have to go for a doctor visit or a physical and you have to urinate in a cup, they test for certain blood things in your urine. They test for glucose, protein, and any other substance. And it kind of gives an overall picture of health to the individual. So here, when you are trying to diagnose a stone in the tube leading from the kidney to the bladder, that would be the ureter. So you would use that as your word root. And then in this case, which of the following is used to diagnose, you would want the procedure. So C is the best answer. Ureteroscope urethroScope is used for the urethra, not the ureter. So please keep in mind those two word roots are separate. The last major groups of words are the complementary terms, and then we'll do the abbreviations, and then you're done with this chapter. The first term on this list is albuminuria. And this has to do with having albumin in your urine. This blood protein found in urine kind of indicates a kidney problem. And you can also have other things in your urine. Looking at the list, we have glycosuria, meaning you have sugar in your urine. Hematuria, as we mentioned before, is blood in the urine. You can also have other specific things with urine. Anuria means that you are the absence of urine or you're not producing urine. Dysuria means painful urine, really meaning painful urination. Nocturia, noct means night, so nocturia would be bedwetting or urinating at night. Oligo means a few, so oliguria, we get rid of that combining O because urea starts with the U. But oliguria means that you have scanty urine. It just means you have some, but not as much as you normally would. The opposite would be polyuria, where you have a lot of urine. You have excess. Your kidneys are filtering out too much fluid. Pyuria would mean you have pus in your urine, probably from some type of infection. Other terms on the list, you have diuresis, and if we remember dia like diagnosis, it means through. So here we have a condition of passing through. Basically, it's another way to say polyuria. You're passing too much urine. Meatal, al is the suffix, means pertaining to. So in this case, it's pertaining to the meatus. We also have some professions here. We have nephrologist and nephrology. So this is the physician and area of study pertaining to the kidney. Whereas later on down the list we have urologist and urology, and this is the person who studies the urinary tract, which could potentially pertain to the kidneys, but usually it's everything more specifically outside of the kidneys in the urinary system. And just as a side note, urology also does deal with the male reproductive system because the male reproductive system and urinary system overlap. So here's the last major list of the chapter. The first term we've kind of sprinkled in throughout the chapter is catheter, abbreviated cath. A catheter is basically a tube that's job is to withdraw or instill, meaning put in fluids. So a urinary catheter is basically something that's inserted into the urethra with the job of being a tube to withdraw or get rid of waste. Distended means stretched out. For example, if you eat a lot of food, your stomach is distended. Or if your bladder is filled with urine, it's distended. Whereas if you just go to the bathroom, then it's no longer distended. Enuresis is involuntary urination, meaning that you are obviously urinating outside of your control. And it goes along with another term, incontinence. Incontinence you might have seen on some of those, medical drug commercials, or even for like Depends underwear. Incontinence is when you have an inability to control your bladder or your bowels. So you can't kind of hold it in and get to the bathroom when you need to get to the bathroom. Hemodialysis. Hemodialysis pertains to, kidneys. So this is the procedure by which impurities are removed from the blood, because your kidneys can't do it for you. You get hooked up to a machine that will filter the blood. Micturate is to urinate or to void. So that could just be a normal process. You don't have to have any kind of medical condition. Micturate just means that you are urinating or voiding waste. Peritoneal dialysis is another way of which to remove toxins or wastes from the kidneys. It goes along with hemodialysis. But in this case, the peritoneal cavity itself is used as a receptacle for the fluid. Stricture is not a word I would really make sure you commit to memory, but it's abnormal narrowing of any kind. So it kind of goes along with stenosis of a narrowing. But you could have a urethral stricture, meaning that it's narrowed. The condition would be urethral stenosis. Urinal, I'm guessing you all know what a urinal is, located in the boys' bathroom. Urinary catheterization kind of goes along with what I said. A catheter is just any generic tube whose job is to deliver or withdraw fluids. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about urinary catheterization. Urodynamics is the study of the force and flow of urine within the digestive tract. And you would look at this to try to pinpoint certain urinary issues. And lastly, void. Void just means that you are emptying your waste material. Mostly talking about urine, but it really could be, getting rid of any particular material. Here's an example of what a urinary catheter would look like for a female. As you can see, the tube has been inserted through the urethra and into the bladder so that the fluid from the bladder can then go out through the tube. Here are the abbreviations for the chapter. I'm not going to go through all of them again, but they were sprinkled throughout the chapter in their full-length version. Practice exercise 41 on page 246 to get more familiar with these. You will be responsible for them. But once you have the full-length terms down, then the abbreviations won't be so difficult to memorize. Which of the following may be used to withdraw fluids? Hopefully you would think immediately of C, because we were just talking about it, as a tube to remove fluids, as in urinary catheterization. As part of every chapter, you should, once finishing all the exercises, make sure that you interpret and read all of the medical passages towards the end of the chapter to try to put all of the words in context. Here's an example medical passage. I want you to practice reading through this aloud and pronouncing the medical terms correctly, but then also interpreting it and kind of getting the gist of what it's talking about. By picking apart the medical terms. I also want you to, work on exercise 41, 42, 43, all the ones in the very back of the chapter. They do a really good job of helping prepare you for the upcoming test.